Kosh, teaching at the American Studies Center, as many of you know. And today I have a great pleasure of introducing a good friend of mine, which I'm very flattered, pleased to say, who is also a very well-known scholar of American poetry. Thomas Austenfeld is he is a professor of American literature, teaching at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland. He also taught at the University of North Georgia College State. He received his PhD in English from University of Virginia. His doctoral dissertation was on Robert Lowell, 1981. So we will see him sort of returning to his roots, to his intellectual roots. So his dissertation was on Robert Lowell, but then he moved on to talk about, to write about several women, many of which were associated with Robert Lowell. And in 2001, he published American Women Writers and the Nazis, Ethics and Politics in Boyle, K. Boyle, Porter, Catherine Ann Porter, Stafford and Hellman. G. Stafford was Robert Lowell's wife. It was published with the University of Virginia in 2001. And since then, he's edited many important books on Kate Boyle, on Barbara Kingsolver, and most recently on Catherine Ann Porter's Ship of Fools, New Interpretations and Transatlantic Contexts. He's the founder, this is something I didn't know, he's the founder of Kate Boyle Society, or one of those authors' societies that organize the social life of scholars, specializing in the work of particular individual authors. So he's the founder of the Kate Boyle Society. He's the author of Kate Boyle Bibliography for Oxford Bibliographies in American Literature. And he's the author of many articles published in important anthologies and journals: Wiley Blackwell Encyclopedia of 20th Century Fiction, Pacific Coast Philology, Mississippi Quarterly, Prose Studies, Studies in American Naturalism, Keats and Shelley Journal. That's what this one is. This one is really hard to get into, which I know very well. A few years ago, I submitted an essay that I thought was brilliant about Shelley to them for consideration, and I was rather brutally rejected by Keats' Shelley Journal. So this one is certainly one I would like to get into. Studies in American Naturalism. So those are the journals he's published in. He's held lots of important positions, administrative positions in the Swiss higher education institutions. He's worked for many years as the Dean of the Humanities at the University of Fribourg. And Lowell is one of the most important poets among his many, many interests. So again, I have a great pleasure to introduce him. Let's give him a big hand.
Very kind of you. Dzień dobry. Right. That's as much Polish as I've learned in the 24 hours since I've been in the country. I want to thank the American Studies Center at the University of Warsaw for hosting me here today. It's a privilege to be speaking with you. I'm thrilled to have such a large audience. And I'm hoping to engage in conversation with you at the end of this talk, during which, given the advancing hour of the afternoon, I hope you will stay awake. I will do my best to keep you awake. I want to express my gratitude to Grzegorz Kosh, who invited me, and who is in fact currently working on reshaping our view of Robert Lowell once again, in his own work, by using the time-honored tools of our trade, namely the philological attention to source texts and painstaking editorial work. Our paths have crossed several times in the past couple of years. He said we've become good friends, that is true. We've crossed paths in California, in Massachusetts, and in Olomouc in the Czech Republic. So now we're here, and next year he'll be in Fribourg, and we'll take it from there. So, my title is called Reassessing the Age of Lowell. I hope those of you sitting in the last row can read this. You probably have better eyesight than I do, so you must be able to handle this. My title, Reassessing, is not completely new. Marjorie Perloff called for a reassessment of the term Age of Lowell more than 30 years ago. In her essay, Poète Maudit of the Gentile Tradition, which she originally published in 1983, she first coined this phrase and asked for its reassessment. She didn't coin the phrase, she asked for its reassessment, and it gained a much wider readership in 1986 when it was republished. So this is the sort of invitation to reassess the Age of Lowell. At that moment, Irvin Ehrenpreis's coining of the term, the Age of Lowell, lay about 20 years in the past. But the difference between 1983 and 1986, those two iterations of Marjorie Perloff, is significant because Ehrenpreis died in July of 1985, there it is, right in between, and would now clearly not perform the reassessment himself, even if Perloff may have intended to nudge him to do so. In choosing to title my presentation with the present continuous verb form reassessing, instead of the conceptual noun reassessment, I'd like to indicate that such an activity remains a permanent desideratum. Scholarship in the humanities lives above all on rethinking ostensibly known things under new circumstances and for new audiences. This is what humanities scholars do. In the American tradition in particular, Ralph Waldo Emerson authorizes this continual renewal in his 1837 address, The American Scholar, which Randall Fuller has called the ur-text of American studies. Emerson observes in there, and I quote, "Each age, it is found, must write its own books, or rather, each generation for the next succeeding. The books of an older period will not fit this." And again, a few lines later, he adds, "Meet young men growing up in libraries, believing it their duty to accept the views which Cicero, which Locke, which Bacon have given, forgetful that Cicero, Locke, and Bacon were only young men in libraries when they wrote these books." So take this to heart as you're sitting in the library. You could be the next Locke, Cicero, or Bacon, because they were once in that situation. Emerson's optimistic formulation of 1837 was challenged at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century by Henry Adams, who had a more pessimistic view that suggested that a teacher is always already too old to instruct his students because they live in their present age and not in the teacher's age. So certainly he's incapable of instructing them for the future. Take that, teachers. However, Adams's Education of 1907 is a document very much concerned with the concept of an age in both the successive historical periods and the writer's own age. He was quite old when he wrote it, as well as his self-placement in his historical time, which is also one of Lowell's intellectual preoccupations. Emerson then furnishes me with the key terms age and generation, which you can see up here in red, using the second as an explanation for the first. He assumes comfortably that ages and generations succeed each other. If we can remove the slightly musty smell from these terms and understand them less dynastically and more sequentially, we may well have found a method to reconsider Lowell in his time, but in such a way so as to understand him in ours. I invoke Emerson and Adams because they share a classic American intellectual iconoclasm that provides a workable background for looking at Robert Lowell, a poet so strongly conscious of the passage of history that he would begin his poetic career by contemplating the role of the Lowells, his own ancestors, in the settling of New England. The poem Children of Light, which you have in your handout, refers to this, and we're coming back to that in about a half hour, so stay with me. He would eventually, Lowell that is, would eventually fossilize his own personal observations, called Notebook, into a volume called History. So he's always conscious of the passage of time into history. Albert Jalpe, another critic, in the same volume from which I quoted Perloff earlier, briefly thinks of the age of Lowell from its other chronological end, that is, from the beginning of Lowell's career, not from the 1965 point of view that Ehrenpreis would use. So Jelpy asks himself how such an appellation, the age of Lowell, might have come about. He says, "There has been something fabulous about Robert Lowell's career from the outset, in part because it was deeply expressive and symptomatic of its period. Lord Weary's Castle, 1946, brought Lowell the Pulitzer Prize before the age, listen to that word, age of 30, for his first commercially published volume. 2 decades later, Irvin Ehrenpreis was able to speak plausibly of the age of Lowell." So, in citing Lord Weary's Castle as evidence of Lowell's career being deeply expressive and symptomatic of its period, Jelpy remarkably suggests that the 40s already were the age of Lowell before it had been so named. His insight renders later criticism of the term all the more short-sighted. We also notice that all these Lowell scholars have a strong historical bent and delight, as I do, in the symmetry of decades that relate events in literary history to one another. Note also, I marked this in red in the previous quote, but I can't go back on this thing here for some reason. Note also that Jelpy, like others, uses the term age to include references to Lowell's biological age and to the age in which he writes. As of 1965 then, with the appearance of Ehrenpreis's essay, there it is, Lowell, in a manner of speaking, had to live up to the appellation of existing in the age of Lowell, though in a sense through no fault of his own, because somebody else coined that phrase for him. The critics merely put into a convenient phrase what he had practiced since the beginning. In thus adjusting a title that's been used before, I want to give the notion of the age of Lowell a new lease on life. If it can remain a meaningful term, I need to clear away some cobwebs. The historical moment for this act of literary dusting that I propose to perform is now. We are approaching the centenary of Lowell's birth in 2017. His birthday comes around for the 100th time. We recognize that his death in 1977 is now 40 years in the past, and his moment of greatest fame perhaps already 50 years in the past. The chronological space for a definition of the age of Lowell is therefore wide open. I will try to articulate 3 ideas, there's the centenary, 3 ideas over the course of this talk. The first is this is my main question. Why is the term the age of Lowell such a red cloth for many critics? Why do they chafe against it? I will argue that the critics tend to react to a claim that Ehrenpreis did not in fact make, and that they confuse the confessional poet of 1959 with the ruminating historian of the sonnet sequences of the late 60s. I want to ask whether we can consider the age of Lowell as a method of writing poetry rather than a chronological or a dynastic marker. The identitarian focus of 60s literature in America is grounded in Lowell's poetry in exemplary fashion. In the decades following, identitarian writing will resurface in the prose memoir, also something that Lowell sort of pioneered, that will eventually allow everyone with access to a computer to compose his or her own autobiographical text to contribute to the memoir boom of the late 1980s.